Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I've already had several introductions by various people, and a few of me have seen me doing the laptop and running around looking like a headless chicken. So it's lovely to be here to present today on the pastoral care of what we call in the UK remand prisoners, people on remand, so people in a pre-trial detention context. It might be in your country, you don't have the same idea of remand or the same context, but when I say remand in today's talk, I'm talking about people waiting for their court date, waiting for trial, waiting for sentencing. So if you were at our Kyiv conference in 2018 in Ukraine, you might have heard me talk about the pastoral care of prisoners, and I was about to start a doctorate in theology and ministry looking at this particular topic. I was about to embark on some scientific, some empirical research in UK prisons. And today I'm here to share with you the outcome of my research. I graduated from my doctorate early in January this year. So I'm now Dr. Dixon, which is very exciting. Thank you. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you around this topic of the pastoral care of remand prisoners. And I'll leave some time at the end, hopefully, for some discussion and some questions. My hope today is this will not be a boring academic lecture. It won't be too stuffy, but that it will be realistic about the challenges that some of us will have in this room about ministering to prisoners who are serving in that remand period, which is often doesn't have an end limit to it. It can go on for very long periods of time sometimes and doesn't have a set date by which it ends. I'm trying to summarize a 70,000 word thesis into 40 minutes, so I won't include everything. I won't talk about all of my findings. I won't go into the literature or the methodology very heavily. If you have more questions about the way I did things, you can ask in the questions, or I'll be sharing the link to my thesis at the end, so you're welcome to read it in your own time. So a bit about me first. I first started in prison chaplaincy when I was 21 years old as a volunteer in a high security prison in the northeast of England. I then spent a number of years training for ministry in a charismatic evangelical church in Durham in the northeast of England, studying a master's in theology and ministry. I spent a number of years working full-time as a chaplain in a variety of prisons, women's prisons, young offenders prisons, high security prisons, and then most recently 6 years in HMP Durham, which is a remand prison of 950 men in the northeast of England. I'm now working in a secure inpatients facility, so a hospital for people who would be in prison, but they are too mentally unwell. So that's where I work currently. At the time I started working at my prison, HMP Durham, the role of the prison changed dramatically. Previously, it was called what's called in the UK a local prison. So in local prisons, you have 50% remand prisoners and 50% short sentence prisoners, people serving a year or two perhaps, or a few months. The Ministry of Justice decided to test out a new kind of prison and decided that our prison would be the one to try it out, a reception prison where we would have 95% remand prisoners. So over the course of a few months, we became 95% remand. Suddenly, the workload of our chaplaincy team of 5 full-time chaplains and many others, the workload went just up and up and up and up and up and up. We had almost 30, 35 new prisoners coming into the prison every single day. Every person who came into the prison was in crisis, struggling, anxious, worried about lack of contact with family. They didn't know how the prison worked. They didn't have appropriate support. They were struggling with mental health issues. People had all sorts of practical problems, and our team of chaplains was overwhelmed. One of the duties, as James mentioned, of an English prison chaplain is that we have to meet every new prisoner within 24 hours of their arrival, everyone held in segregation, everyone in the hospital wing, visit every prisoner at risk of suicide or self-harm once a week, as well as everything else: pastoral conversations, services, faith-based classes and groups, and supporting staff. In our new situation, our workload had become almost unbearable. And it was this situation that made me think, why? What is it about being on remand which is so challenging for prisoners? And what is it about serving remand prisoners which is so challenging for chaplains? What is actually going on? So I decided to go and gather some data for my research project. As you might know, research into prison chaplaincy, it's not a big area, particularly in England. There aren't a lot of academic studies into prison chaplaincy. There's a few PhD theses which are quite interesting that have been written in the last few years on working with long sentence prisoners, working in Scottish prisons, one about Anglican chaplains, but there aren't very many. So I decided that I would go and interview prisoners and chaplains at a number of different prisons around the north of England about their experiences. And this is using a methodology which is called grounded theory. Grounded theory says we don't get a hypothesis, an idea, and then test it out. We go to the data first. We go and ask the people on the ground, the prisoners, the chaplains, what are your experiences? And then as we listen to their responses, themes, patterns will begin to emerge, which we will turn into eventually an idea, a thesis, a hypothesis that we can look at and see, is this true to life? And so that's what I did. So I designed a study where I would visit 3 prisons and interview 15 chaplains and 15 prisoners. They would be of all faiths and none. It would be entirely voluntary. Nobody would be made to take part. And I used my own prison as a pilot study. You can imagine that it's not very ethical for me to go and ask prisoners that I'm looking after, how is the pastoral care in this prison? You can imagine not very ethical. So I used that as a trial study to see if my questions worked, if people were interested. I interviewed each person for about 45 minutes. Prisoners, I asked them, what's the most difficult thing about being on remand? What do you miss most about being in prison? What's the hardest thing for you? I asked them, have you had any interactions with the chaplaincy team? And what did you make of them? Everything they said was anonymous. It wasn't fed back to the chaplains. Everything they said was completely, they were given fake names and everything. And the only issues were if they told me they were going to hurt someone or themselves, I had to tell someone about that. I asked them, what do you think a good chaplain should be doing in the prison? What do you think about remand prisons? What are they getting right? What are they getting wrong? And after I'd done that, I went to speak to the chaplains. I spoke to chaplains of all faiths and none. I spoke to a non-religious chaplain, as we were hearing there as well. I asked them, what's your experience of delivering pastoral care in a remand context? What's the most challenging thing that you think prisoners are struggling with? How do you approach your work? What's your theology of chaplaincy, if you have one? And I was keen for this research not just to be something that I could put in my CV, but something that would actually change how prison chaplains worked on the ground. I was keen for this to be a resource for people who were busy doing the pastoral care on the ground. And what I did is, once I'd spoken to everyone, I had a dictaphone. I'd had permission to bring this in. I had ethical permission from the Ministry of Justice to do the research. I did the interviews, I transcribed them all, which took a long time, and then I started to code them using a piece of software that could pick up themes, patterns, words that were emerging. And then gradually themes did start to emerge, and it's these themes I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of the session today. I have to say it was really amazing to be able to listen to prisoners' stories. So often we can't share the things that we're told in prison. We're told them in confidence, but here was an opportunity to let prisoners speak for themselves and to give a voice to people who don't usually have a voice to try and change things. So I'm going to talk about 2 major themes that came out of the study. And if there's time, I'm going to talk about some of my theological reflections that came out of the study. But here's 2 main themes. I've realized I've not used the PowerPoint at all, but we'll get there in a bit. And it's doing nothing at all. That's fine. Here we go. I'll get to him in a minute. So the first theme I'm going to talk about is the theme of trust. The theme of trust. The theme of trust was repeated in almost every interview that I did. In the majority of the interviews, trust was either alluded to or mentioned directly. Chaplains were seen as one of the very few members of staff that prisoners would trust. And often they were placed in comparison with officers who were widely seen as untrustworthy. I've changed all the names, but a prisoner I'm going to call Umar, when commenting on what chaplaincy for, he said, chaplains are there just to be there, not to judge or be judgmental, to be there as someone you can trust in, someone you can be faithful with to yourself, to be there for you in the good times as well as the bad. Often, chaplains were compared favorably with prison officers who were described mostly in negative terms: lazy, they just shout, they just say no, they don't treat us like human beings. Better words were reserved for older officers who had maybe more people skills compared to some of the younger prison officers who really couldn't deal with some of the complex people they were meeting. But what is it that makes chaplains trustworthy? What is it about us that makes prisoners trust us? And looking at the data in a remand context, it was really interesting to see where that trust came from. Because the prison environment doesn't lend itself to being a place where trust can grow. Many studies show that when prisoners first come into prison, one of the first things that they learn is not to trust anyone. And you'll know this. You're taught, don't trust the person in your cell. Don't trust the officers. Don't trust anyone but yourself. Don't share anything with anyone. Don't be vulnerable. Don't let anyone get to you. Put up the armor, put on a mask, raise the walls. But interviews with prisoners suggested that there was inherent trustworthiness in the person of the chaplain. Even if they'd never met a chaplain before, they knew the chaplain was someone they could trust. Many prisoners spoke of chaplains having trust, integrity, they were authentic. They said that chaplains were neutral figures, people who could be accountable, who had integrity. They delivered on what was promised. Prisoners spoke warmly of chaplains' input to the prison environment, how they would share things with prison chaplains that they would never share with anybody else. But one of the biggest reasons for trust in remand was that the chaplain was the person who got things done. They were the person who got things done. Prisoners would approach chaplains with any and every request, particularly requests that officers wouldn't or couldn't fulfill. One prisoner, Samuel, said, if it wasn't for the chaplaincy, stuff doesn't get done. He goes on to say elsewhere, he said, if I ask an officer to do something for me, like get my glasses from reception or make a phone call to my family or even just get me a toilet roll or a toothbrush, they may not do it, or they may do it very, very slowly. If I ask a prison chaplain, they'll get right onto it. They do what they say. If they promise something, they will always deliver. He said, you know, it took my glasses 5 weeks to get here. They were delivered on a visit by my nephew. And if a chaplain hadn't got involved, I still wouldn't have them now. And this theme is really crucial. So many things are missed on remand when you get into prison. And you'll know this, that when somebody comes into prison, they're meant to get certain things like information and the basics, a towel, a toothbrush, toilet roll. Often that gets missed in very busy prisons. But the chaplains were the people who filled in the gaps and took an interest when they made that initial visit on what had been missed and how they could put it right. Often chaplains went the extra mile, and many chaplains remarked on how these practical acts of service were just as much a part of their ministry as preaching the gospel on a Sunday or leading a Bible study. Now, sometimes doing these little jobs that aren't really part of our work can seem like a waste of time when you'd rather be having that in-depth conversation about Jesus, but actually you're running around trying to find toilet rolls. You can think, what am I doing with my time? But actually, for prisoners, these were acts that opened up a space that allowed for vulnerability and deeper conversations later on down the line. It showed people that we cared and that we could be trusted. One chaplain said, "The chaplaincy team, I've had nothing but affection, understanding, warmth, love, and patience." And now to hear the word love in a prison context is so unusual, particularly in a place where people are encouraged not to trust members of staff. Trust had been built here because of the compassion and kindness of chaplains that the prisoners had encountered. One prisoner said, I think they're neutral. They're not like staff. They're not like officers. They can help. They can contact home, things like that. And the idea of the chaplain as a neutral figure is something that other researchers have picked up on, that we sit on the margins, and this is a theme I'm going to pick up later on, but chaplains sit on the margins between competing expectations. In England, we're employed directly by the government most of the time, or by the prison service, but we're somehow seen as separate from the prison service. We're seen as outside the prison hierarchy, and this is really valuable, that we're not seen as part of the system that is controlling them. Some prisoners thought the trusting in chaplains was a historic thing, you know, the traditional vicar, local trusted vicar, but more often it was based around practical acts of service and compassion. The very busy nature of remand prisoners gave chaplains opportunities to build trust more quickly than in long-term sentence prisons, where often you have to work over much longer periods of time to gain trust, and working in a secure hospital where people are spending up to 20, 25 years, I found that to be the case. It takes a lot longer to build that trust. Now, the second theme I want to look at is the theme of liminality. Liminality. Now, you may not be familiar with this word, so I'm going to explain it. I'm going to put it in context first. Okay, I'll come back to that. There's another quote that's not here. One prisoner said, "It's like you work for the prison, but you don't work for the prison. You're somewhere in the middle." One chaplain said, "One of the strengths of chaplaincy is it's not institutionalized as much as everything else that goes on in the prison." And I'm conscious, how do you maintain our liminality, which is its strength, when we're trusted, partly because we're not perceived as being part of the institution? So the word liminality, it comes from anthropological study that was done in the 1960s by Victor Turner and Van Gennep and a number of others, who were looking at rites of passage, rituals, things like baptisms, pilgrimages, and the like. And there's a point in every ritual where you go from one place, what's come before, to a liminal place, a bit in the middle where everything's up in the air. Anything can happen. Something is changing within you. And then you come out to a place afterwards, what's called aggregation. And liminal comes from the Latin word limen, liminis, which means a doorway or a threshold. It means somewhere on the margin, somewhere in between spaces. Liminality was seen by prisoners as the main challenge of being on remand. The main challenge of being on remand was being in a liminal place. It's that place of the unknown, a place where nothing is certain, nothing is fixed. It's the unknown wait. How long will I wait until my court case? How long might I get my sentence? When will I be able to speak to my family? When will I be able to do such and such? And it may seem strange, but many prisoners said they would much prefer to know what their sentence was and it to be a long sentence than to spend any more time on remand, waiting and waiting and waiting for something that may or may not ever happen. And what it happened to prisoners is they said that as time progressed on remand, it started to break down their sense of identity, who they were. They started to forget what life was like outside of prison. They started to forget what they were there for. There was a sense that all their life was just on hold. They were stuck in a cycle. Prisoners described the remand period as being full of anxiety, that they struggled to cope and adapt to their environment, that their mental health really suffered. They struggled to connect with their family and loved ones. They felt disconnected and disorientated from what had come before. And this was made worse if people went through cycles of remand. And you will have all met these prisoners. They're your regulars. You know their name. You see them as soon as you open the door of the cell and you think, oh, it's you again. And some people would come in on remand 5, 6, 7, I know one person would come 10 times in a year, just little petty offences going in and out and in and out. And that cycle of remand does something to you. It breaks you down as a person. One man said, I've spent half my adult life in prison. He'd been in and out of prison for 40 years. And of those 40 years, he'd spent 20 years total in prison, just little sentences. Many prisoners spoke of growing up within institutions, going from secure children's homes to young offenders prisons to adult prisons, and just going in and out. That was their life. And that they felt that their sense of place in the world was fractured. Partly prisoners put this down to a lack of information in the prison, that there wasn't readily available information in the way there was meant to be, and they had to work things out for themselves, but also a way in which the environment was geared up not to support them. Many prisons in the UK, as James mentioned, are old, are falling apart, are quite fragile, but also the bureaucratic and administrative systems of our prisons were almost geared up to stop people from getting the information they wanted, to doing the things they wanted to do, to feeling at home in the prison environment. One prisoner said, nothing ever gets resolved here. It all just goes on pause. Nothing ever really gets done. One prisoner said, it's like being in limbo, because when you're on remand, even though the time will come off you're sentenced, you'd rather be sentenced and getting on with your sentence. It's like being in purgatory. You don't know when you're getting out, and that effect it has on your mental health. Anxiety, I'm up and down all the time. My behavior is erratic. I end up fighting with the prison officers and things like that. There were lots of areas that made life on remand hard, but this was the main one that caught my eye, this sense of being caught in limbo. And chaplains were aware of this. They recognized the difficulty, particularly for new prisoners who'd never been in prison, of navigating the prison environment and its structures. And chaplains saw their role as guides, navigators, helping people through this unfamiliar stage of this limbo, this being on remand. If you like your classical literature, maybe think of Dante's Inferno and Purgatory. The chaplain is like Virgil, navigating people through limbo, hopefully to a better place afterwards. Chaplains describe themselves as guides, accompaniers, confidants, advocates. Chaplains wanted to help people keep their identities intact, but also maybe to form new ones, better identities. Chaplains describe themselves as non-judgmental listeners, guides, problem solvers, movable safe spaces, providing a visible presence in a place where everything else was up and down. Chaplains wanted to help prisoners to reorient their lives in a time of deep disorientation. They understood the complexities of remand life. And this also feeds into why they were trusted so much. They were helping people walk through this difficult period. And one of the questions here is, why is it that chaplains are the best people to do this? Why is it that we are the people who are best placed to help guide people through liminal stages? Well, what my research suggested is that because we also are liminal figures. We are liminal people. Chaplaincy, as you know, takes place on the boundaries of different expectations and obligations. There are the expectations of the prisoners. What do they expect from us? The expectation of the prison service that we serve. What do they expect from us? We have the expectations of the faith communities and denominations we come from. What do they expect from us? And last but not least, what do we believe God expects from us? What are our own expectations? And often we are on the boundaries trying to juggle all those different expectations at once. We are margins on the margins of all the groups we're in. We're on the margins of the prison hierarchy. We have a limited amount of power, and yet we have the ability to get around many of the traditional structures and hierarchies within the prison. Like James was saying earlier on, a prison chaplain can be in all places in the prison, speak to the lowest prisoner in segregation, and then go straight into the governor's office and speak to them as well. They are on the margins often of their faith communities, and many of you who I've spoken to will know this. You sometimes feel marginalized from your faith communities because they may not understand what prison chaplains do or really appreciate our work. Sometimes we're on the margins of our own theology. Sometimes, and I don't know if you've had this experience, when we're working in prisons, our theology has to stretch, and we end up right on the edges of what we feel is theologically acceptable, having to work in very grey areas, in areas that we probably didn't train for where we were training for ministry. Now, this might seem quite negative, but actually, my research suggests that being a liminal figure can actually be really positive for chaplains. If we feel marginalized in our work, what I want to suggest today is that's not necessarily a bad thing and can actually be a benefit for our work in the prisons. Chaplains described how they were sometimes able to accomplish more because of their liminal status. Being on the margins allowed them to navigate the prisons with greater ease, speaking directly to those with power and decision-making. If the prison had good working relationships, chaplains' words could carry weight. They could get things done in a way that nobody else could. Within reason, everything in the prison was the business of the chaplain. In the interviews, chaplains mentioned that prisoners regularly came to them with the phrase, "I know it's not your business, but could you help me with such and such? Could you help me with this? Could you help me with that?" Although rules, policies, and expectations changed all the time in prisons, chaplains describe themselves as well-equipped to deal with any change they might face. One chaplain described their role as squishy. I don't know how that translates, but squishy and malleable, able to fit into different molds and shapes depending on the task ahead of them. And one of the ways this came out in the study was in chaplains' roles as prophetic characters. And it's interesting using the word prophet. I don't mean that as in telling the future, but speaking truth to power. Later on in the study, and I won't go into this in detail, I worked a lot with Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination, which, if you haven't read, is a wonderful, really interesting book about the prophetic nature of ministry. But it was interesting that Christian, Muslim, and non-religious chaplains all use this word prophetic to mean that chaplains spoke up for the powerless. They spoke up on behalf of prisoners. They were an advocate, speaking out against perceived injustices, seeing where the prison was not doing its job, and going to those in power saying, "We need to do something about this." And this is a challenging place to be a prophetic character, because they are liminal figures. They can be too much of a thorn in the side of the governor, and then you're in their bad books, you can't get anything done. But then if you sidle up too much to the authority, you're seen as a friend of the establishment and prisoners won't trust you. It's like James was saying earlier, those competing expectations when we run into power. One of the tricky bits about being a liminal figure is that sometimes your role is not very clearly defined. Chaplains had job descriptions in all the prisons I went to, but often that was just the beginning of what they actually did on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes it was just having the creative freedom to minister and just to be present on the wing of the prison, just to be present amongst the prisoners with no preconceived idea of what they were meant to be doing, but just to be there, to listen, to notice, to speak to people. to be attentive. Often chaplains were chaplains in the gaps. They filled in provision that wasn't being met elsewhere. They made links between different prison departments. They got things done. They communicated well with others. But there's a tension here as well. If we have a job that's not well defined, we can feel like maybe we don't fit in. And in some chaplaincy studies, this is an issue that's called role fusion, this idea that we have all these competing expectations on our time. Many chaplains struggled with this. They often said to me they felt misunderstood. They lamented the lack of structure in their role. They saw teams pulling in different directions. Some said that they'd lost their original passion for their ministry because it wasn't what they had expected. Some felt very disconnected from their faith communities. And you may know this if you're in your prison on a Sunday or doing services regularly, you may not have that time to connect with your faith communities and churches. Sometimes chaplains just felt like administrative staff, messengers, just being sent with administrative duties to do. Prisoners were just asking them question after question after question, and they really didn't have time for anything. They were just running around. I could talk a little bit more, but what I'd really like to do is give a space for questions. But what I am going to talk about very briefly is lament. And this is one of the big theological things that came out of lament. Lament in the Bible is often found in the Psalms and in the books of prophets like Jeremiah. Lament is something that came up in a lot of the interviews. During the interviews, both in the words spoken and the physical presentation of those I spoke to, prisoners' anger and sadness and frustration just boiled to the surface as if they'd just been waiting for someone to talk to who would listen. And everything just rushed to the surface, whether in the animated retelling of wrongs that have been done to them or by them, or in the kind of arms folded, single word answer brusqueness of someone who's just learned not to trust somebody with a name badge and a dictaphone. Prisoners recounted the difficulties they'd experienced living in prison. They mourned the losses of wasted years, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years wasting away in prison. Time spent in dwindling away in cramped and dilapidated prison cells. Complaints about the lack of compassion from prison staff. The injustices of sentences that seem too harsh. The disconnected relationships with family, loved ones, children who they never saw. Prisoners appear to be fighting back against the feeling that they were becoming institutionalized, that one day the revolving door of prison would suddenly snap shut on them, and they would be trapped within the narrow confines of the prison wings forever. Lament, which is the open and express grieving of that which has been lost or failed to materialize. Lament was the natural language of the prisoner, and you'll know this from your experience. Now, in Walter Brueggemann's study of the Psalms, he notices a common pattern in the lament Psalms. Lament Psalms often start in a place of orientation, where everything is going well. But then they come to a place of disorientation, where everything has gone wrong, and they don't know where God is in this situation. They often then come to a place of reorientation, though not always. And if you've read Psalm 88, you'll know that not all Psalms end in a place of reorientation. Some of them end with the phrase, "Darkness is my closest friend." And it's this lament space, this disorientation space, that is a liminal space, a place where everything's up in the air and nothing is certain. But it's a place where the chaplain dwells, the place of lament. And it's through the expression of lament to God that we can find orientation again. That's what the psalmist does. They lament to God, and through lamenting find orientation. And it's my suggestion in my research that this is what the chaplains are helping prisoners to do. Who else is going to listen to the laments of prisoners? Who else is going to listen to those difficult stories that Per was talking about this morning that weigh heavily on our souls? Chaplains are the people who will listen to those stories, will help prisoners lament, and then will bring those laments to God. It's through that place that we can bring prisoners through to a place of reorientation, maybe re-understanding their situations in the light of God and his presence. Chaplains help people to lament and find a space to express their feelings and vulnerability. Sometimes in remand, that place of reorientation very rarely happens. Some prisoners never get there, and chaplains were okay with this. They were willing to sit with people who might never get to that place where they got out, got the family together, got a job, got their life back on track. They were aware some people would just keep coming in and out and in and out, but were willing to sit with those people who were seen as hopeless cases by others. In the rest of my study, I talk about a ministry of presence and how it was very important for chaplains not just to rush around doing things, but sometimes just to be there for prisoners, and that actually prisoners wanted that. Sometimes they wanted prison chaplains who weren't just rushing around doing tasks for them, but just had the time for them. People don't stop a busy chaplain. People don't stop someone who walks fast through a prison wing, but they'll stop you if you walk slowly. And I'll talk about that at another time. But if you want to read a book on this, Sam Wells' book, Incarnational Mission and Incarnational Ministry, and I'll put a link to that later on, is a good book to look at that. I'll finish with a quote and then we'll have some questions. One prisoner said, "The chaplain's role is just to be there for prisoners when they need them." I said to another prison, "What is the role of the chaplain?" He said, "Just to be there." I said, could you clarify what you mean by that? He said, "No, just to be there, to be a presence, to be around us." Sometimes we want to rush in as chaplains and fix everything, to rush around, especially in a remand environment, and fix all the problems we see. But my research also suggested that while that builds trust, we also need to spend time just being present and being there, because sometimes people are in situations that are unfixable, certainly humanly speaking, and unsolvable. One research paper that one of my supervisors wrote was called "Is Being There Enough?" in chaplaincy. What my research seemed to suggest was, yes, sometimes just being there, even if you feel like you're not doing anything, even if you feel like your work isn't doing anything practical, sometimes just being there in that liminal space as a liminal figure, sometimes that's enough. And that's where I'd like to leave us for today. Thank you.